I saved a child's life and became a villain in the eyes of their parents. I was walking home from work when I heard yelling directly above me, followed by the sight of a baby falling out of a window 5 stories high. It hurled through the air, and my brain didn't even think. My body just reacted as I dropped my suitcase and held my arms out to catch the baby as close to my chest as possible. It landed directly in my arms as I curled into it, doing everything to ensure it suffered as little impact damage as possible. I dropped to my knees, too scared to check on it but praying it was alive. After seconds that probably felt like hours, I heard the baby's weak crying. It was alive. The parents, a couple in their late 40s, came running out of the building seconds later. They were sobbing, terrified, grabbing the baby from my arms. "Thank you, thank you, you saved our baby," the mother kept repeating. The father hugged me, tears streaming down his face. An ambulance arrived and took the baby to the hospital. The parents called me a hero. I went home feeling anxious but proud of myself. 1 week later, someone knocked on my door. I opened it to find a man in a suit handing me an envelope. I ripped it open, thinking maybe the parents sent a thank you letter or money. Instead, I saw lawsuit papers. Apparently, the impact damage from me catching the child broke both his arms and legs. He was alive but in critical condition, and the parents were now suing me for $2 million. Criminal child endangerment and reckless rescue attempt. If I lost, I was looking at 5 to 10 years in prison. I called the parents 15 times but got no answer. I immediately drove to their apartment. The father opened the door and his face went red. "You broke our baby!" He physically pushed me. "Get away from us before we call the police." He slammed the door in my face. The next morning, I went to my assigned public defendant, Mr. Ramsey. He was juggling 40 cases and barely had time to look at mine. "This doesn't look good," he said. "Technically, you did cause the injuries. Law doesn't really care about intentions." I looked at him dumbfounded. "Just take the plea deal. 2 years is better than 10, he told me. The preliminary hearing 3 weeks later was a nightmare. The prosecutor stood up with photos of the baby's x-rays. The defendant's reckless actions directly caused these fractures. The parents testified, crying about their traumatized baby. Several witnesses said they saw me drop the baby. I don't know if they were hired or where they came from because there was nobody around. I walked out in disbelief this was actually happening. The day before the final trial, Mr. Ramsey called with a new plea deal. 3 years in prison. Take it. If we go to trial and lose, you're looking at 10. I saved that baby's life. I'm not pleading guilty. That night, I broke down in my apartment. The next day, the courtroom was packed. The parents sat in the front row looking like grieving victims. The prosecutor's opening statement destroyed me while Mr. Ramsey's opening was weak and unprepared. I could see it in the judge's eyes. She'd already made up her mind. The prosecution spent 2 days presenting their case. Expert witnesses, medical testimony, the parents crying on the stand. It was over. I was going to prison for catching a falling baby. At the end of the trial, the prosecutor stood up. "Does the defense have any witnesses?" "No, Your Honor." "Mr. Ramsey replied. The judge looked at him. "Does the defense have anything else?" Mr. Ramsey said no. The judge was about to bang her gavel when the courtroom doors burst open. A young woman limped in on crutches, her leg in a cast. The parents' faces went ghost white. "Who are you?" the judge asked. "Betty Rodriguez, their former foster daughter," she pointed at the parents. "I have evidence of what really happened that day." Betty limped forward and handed the judge her phone. The judge looked at the screen. Her face changed from annoyed to shocked to furious in seconds. "Bailiff, lock those doors. Nobody leaves." She connected Betty's phone to the courtroom screen. "I'm going to play this for everyone." The video started. Its timestamp showed 2 minutes before the baby fell out of the window. The father was at the window looking down at the street. "He's there," he was referring to me. "Same time as always." The mother joined him. "You're sure he walks under this window?" She then picked up the baby. "And you're absolutely sure we can sue?" The lawyer said as long as there's injury, we can make millions. "But what if we're drowning in debt? This is our way out." The mother held the baby near the window. "Remember, the baby climbed out of its crib and fell, and he just happened to be walking by and caught it. Perfect. He's right below us. Now!" The mother dropped the baby. The video continued. They watched from the window. "Oh my God, he caught him. Is the baby hurt? We need the baby to be hurt." They rushed to the door. "Remember, we thank him first, then sue later." The courtroom exploded. Everyone was shouting. The parents were screaming, "That's fake! She edited it." Betty pulled out a thick folder. "I have more." What was in that folder made me realize there was more that the parents wanted than just money. Betty walked forward and dropped the thick folder on the judge's desk. The sound echoed through the silent courtroom like a gunshot. The judge opened it and started flipping through the pages. Her face changed fast. First, she looked curious, then shocked, then disgusted. She kept turning pages and her expression got worse with each one. The parents started screaming from their seats. The father yelled that Betty was lying, that she made everything up. The mother shouted that Betty was crazy, that she had mental problems. They both kept saying Betty had a grudge against them, that she was trying to get revenge for something that never happened. The judge slammed her gavel down 3 times. The banging was so loud it made me jump. She told the parents to be quiet or she'd charge them with contempt of court. They stopped yelling, but the mother was still crying and shaking her head. The judge looked at both lawyers and told them to approach the bench right now. Mr. Ramsey stood up and walked forward with the prosecutor. I watched Mr. Ramsey's face as the judge showed him something from the folder. His eyes went wide and his mouth opened a little. He looked back at me with this expression I'd never seen before, like he finally believed I was telling the truth. The prosecutor looked pale and kept shaking his head while reading whatever the judge was showing them. They whispered back and forth for a few minutes while everyone in the courtroom sat there waiting. The judge finally told them to return to their seats. She announced a 30-minute recess and said the parents had to stay in the courtroom under bailiff supervision. 2 bailiffs moved to stand near the parents' seats. Betty was escorted to a private room by another bailiff for her safety. I just sat there shaking. My hands were trembling and I couldn't stop them. Someone actually came forward to help me. After weeks of thinking I was completely alone, that nobody believed me, that I was going to prison for saving a life, someone showed up with proof. I couldn't process it. During the recess, Mr. Ramsey came over and sat next to me. For the first time since this whole thing started, he looked at me like I was a real person instead of just another case number. He told me he was sorry. He said he should have believed me sooner, should have investigated more, should have fought harder. He admitted he was too overwhelmed with his caseload to give my case the attention it needed. His honesty didn't fix the damage or erase the weeks of terror, but it was something. At least he was being real with me now. The 30 minutes felt like hours. I kept looking at the parents sitting there with the bailiffs nearby. They weren't crying anymore. They just looked angry and scared. The courtroom filled back up when the recess ended. The judge came back in and everyone stood up. She told everyone to sit down and then asked Betty to approach the witness stand. Betty limped forward on her crutches and sat down. The bailiff swore her in and she put her hand on the Bible. The judge asked her to state her full name for the record. Betty said her name was Betty Rodriguez. She explained she lived with the parents as a foster child for 2 years when she was 16 years old. The parents' lawyer jumped up immediately and objected. He said this testimony was irrelevant to the current case, that whatever happened years ago had nothing to do with what I did. The judge looked annoyed and overruled the objection. She told Betty to continue. Betty explained she was in a coffee shop across the street that day. She saw the whole thing happen from the window. She recorded it on her phone because she recognized the parents walking past earlier. She knew from her experience living with them that they were always planning something. When she saw them at that window looking down, she started recording. The parents' lawyer tried to object again, but the judge shut him down fast. Betty kept talking. She said she stayed in contact with other kids who used to live with those parents as foster children. 3 other kids went through similar things. The parents would stage accidents and then try to profit from insurance claims and lawsuits. The pattern was always the same. Stage an accident, find someone to blame, sue for money. One kid got pushed down the stairs and they blamed a teacher who tried to help. Another kid was involved in a fake car accident. Every time, the parents found a way to make money off it. The prosecutor looked like someone punched him in the stomach. His face went white, and he put his hand on his desk like he needed to steady himself. His whole case just fell apart in front of everyone. He stood up and asked the judge for a sidebar. The judge agreed and they walked to the side of the courtroom. They whispered back and forth, but I could tell it was heated. The prosecutor kept gesturing and shaking his head. Meanwhile, the parents' lawyer was taking notes really fast and making phone calls from the defense table. His hands were shaking while he dialed. The judge came back and told everyone to pay attention. She ordered the video to be played again, but this time with the audio enhanced. The courtroom screen lit up again. The parents' voices came through the speakers crystal clear. You could hear every word of their plan. The father talking about timing, about me walking under the window. The mother asking if they could really sue. Both of them calculating how much money they could get. Then the mother saying now and dropping the baby. Their voices after, hoping the baby was hurt enough to sue but not dead, planning to thank me first and sue later. Several people in the jury gasped. One woman in the front row started crying. Another juror looked angry and was staring at the parents with disgust. The parents just sat there looking down at the table. Betty pulled more papers out of the folder. She explained these were medical records from the hospital. The baby had been to the emergency room 4 times in the past year. Each visit was for suspicious injuries. Each time the parents blamed someone else. A babysitter who they said dropped him. A daycare worker who supposedly wasn't watching carefully. A neighbor who they claimed let him fall. Child Protective Services opened investigations each time, but the parents always moved to a new area before anything stuck. They would pack up and leave, start over in a new place, take in new foster kids, and run the same schemes all over again. The prosecutor stood up and his hand was shaking as he held onto his desk. He looked at the judge and his voice came out weak and unsteady when he spoke. He said he was moving to dismiss all charges against me immediately, and he also requested the parents be taken into custody right now on suspicion of child endangerment, fraud, and conspiracy. The courtroom exploded into noise again, with everyone talking at once, and the parents' lawyer was yelling objections, but nobody could hear him over the chaos. Two bailiffs started walking toward the parents, and the father's eyes went wide when he saw them coming. He jumped up from his seat and tried to run for the back door, but he only made it 3 steps before 2 bailiffs grabbed him and tackled him to the ground. People in the gallery were standing up trying to see what was happening, and the mother started screaming that they did it for their baby, that they needed the money to give him a better life, that I should have just paid them and none of this would have happened. Her voice was high and desperate, and she kept screaming the same things over and over while the bailiffs pulled the father back to his feet and held his arms behind his back. The judge was banging her gavel over and over, trying to get everyone to calm down, but it took almost a minute before the noise died down enough for her to talk. She told everyone to sit down and be quiet, or she would clear the courtroom. Once it was mostly silent, she looked right at me and said she was formally dismissing all charges against me with prejudice and ordering my immediate release from any legal obligation related to this case. Then she turned to the parents and her voice got hard and cold. She said she was issuing a bench warrant for their arrest on multiple charges, including child abuse, fraud, attempted extortion, perjury, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The bailiffs moved in and put handcuffs on both of them, while another bailiff read them their rights. The mother was sobbing now instead of screaming and kept saying, "Please, please, we're sorry," but the father just stood there with his head down, looking defeated. His whole body seemed to sag like all the fight went out of him at once. I sat there in my chair, unable to move or think or feel anything. My brain couldn't process what was happening. The bailiffs were putting handcuffs on the parents who had been sitting in the front row crying about their traumatized baby just minutes ago. The same parents who almost sent me to prison for catching their kid. The mother was begging for mercy between sobs and trying to pull away from the bailiff holding her arm. The father stayed completely silent and wouldn't look at anyone as they led him toward the side door. This was really happening. I was actually free. The charges were dismissed. I wasn't going to prison. The thought kept running through my head, but it didn't feel real yet. My hands were gripping the armrest of my chair so hard my knuckles were white, and I realized I had been holding my breath. I let it out slowly and tried to make my body relax, but I just felt numb and empty, like I was watching everything happen to someone else. Betty was still sitting in the witness stand, and the judge turned to her and asked if she had anything else to add to her testimony. Betty nodded and started explaining that the folder contained financial records showing the parents were $300,000 in debt from gambling and failed business ventures. She said they had been running insurance scams for at least 5 years, and probably longer, always targeting good people who were just trying to help someone in trouble. She pulled out bank statements and credit card bills and loan documents and spread them across the witness stand. The judge leaned forward to look at them, and her face got even more angry as she read through the papers. Betty explained how the parents would stage an accident, find someone with good insurance or a decent income, and then sue them for everything they could get. Sometimes they would settle out of court, sometimes they would go to trial, but they always walked away with money. The pattern was the same every single time, and they had been getting away with it for years by moving to new cities before anyone could connect the cases together. The judge thanked Betty for her courage in coming forward and asked if she needed protection from potential retaliation. Betty said she had already filed for a restraining order against the parents and had been working with a lawyer to make sure she stayed safe. The judge promised to expedite the restraining order and said she would assign a court advocate to help Betty with anything she needed. She also said Betty's testimony would be crucial in the criminal case against the parents and thanked her again for doing the right thing, even though it must have been scary. Betty nodded and wiped her eyes, and the judge told her she could step down from the witness stand. The judge then called for another recess to give everyone time to process what had just happened and to allow the prosecutor's office to coordinate with the police about the parents' arrest. Ramsey came over to me right after the judge left the courtroom, and he looked like he wanted to say something but didn't know how to start. Finally, he just said he was sorry and that the public defender system had failed me completely. He admitted he should have investigated more, should have pushed harder, should have believed me when I said I was innocent. His voice was quiet, and he kept looking down at his hands instead of at me. He said he wanted to help me file a lawsuit against the parents for malicious prosecution if I was interested, though he warned me they probably had no assets to collect since they were drowning in debt. I told him I just wanted this nightmare to be over, and I didn't care about getting money from them. I just wanted to go home and try to forget any of this ever happened. He nodded and said he understood, but gave me his card anyway in case I changed my mind later. A man in an expensive suit approached me in the hallway outside the courtroom while I was standing there trying to figure out what to do next. He introduced himself as Garrison and said he was a defense attorney who had been following my case in the news. He told me his firm specialized in wrongful prosecution cases, and he believed I had strong grounds for legal action against the city, the prosecutor's office, and the parents. He said he wanted to represent me pro bono in any civil matters and help me seek compensation for everything I had been through. His firm would handle all the costs and legal fees, and I wouldn't owe them anything unless we won. He handed me his business card and said to call him when I was ready to talk about my options. He seemed genuine and professional, but I was too overwhelmed to think about lawsuits or compensation right then. I took his card and thanked him and told him I would think about it. Betty found me still standing in the hallway a few minutes later, and we finally got to talk face to face without a courtroom full of people watching. She explained that she had been tracking the parents for 2 years since she aged out of foster care at 18. She knew they would eventually hurt someone badly enough that she could stop them, and she had been collecting evidence the whole time. She apologized for not coming forward sooner, but said she needed ironclad proof that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. She had to wait for them to make a mistake big enough that the evidence would be undeniable. When she saw them drop the baby and then sue me, she knew this was the moment she had been waiting for. She had been in the coffee shop across the street that day and recognized them immediately. She started recording on her phone the second she saw them at the window because she knew from experience they were planning something terrible. I looked at Betty and felt my throat get tight and my eyes start to burn. I told her she saved my life, and that without her testimony and evidence I would be going to prison right now for catching a falling baby. I would have lost everything and spent years locked up for doing the right thing. Betty's eyes filled with tears, and she said she knew what it was like to be blamed for things that weren't your fault. The parents had done the same thing to her for 2 years when she lived with them. They would stage accidents and force her to lie about what happened, and when she refused, they would punish her in ways that left no visible marks. She said she couldn't let them destroy another person's life the way they had tried to destroy hers. We stood there in the courthouse hallway, and I gave her a hug and thanked her again. She had risked everything to tell the truth, and I owed her more than I could ever repay. The prosecutor walked toward me while Betty and I were still standing there. 2 other officials followed behind him. He stopped in front of me and his face looked different from it had in the courtroom. He apologized for pursuing charges without proper investigation. His voice was quiet, and he seemed genuinely sorry. He explained his office would be conducting a full review of how this case was handled. Then he told me the FBI would be investigating the parents' fraud scheme across multiple states. The 2 officials with him nodded, and one of them handed me a business card. They asked if I would be available for interviews in the coming weeks. I said yes and put the card in my pocket. Betty watched the whole exchange with her arms crossed. After they walked away, she asked if I was okay. I told her I honestly didn't know. We exchanged phone numbers and she said to call her if I needed anything. Then she limped back toward the courtroom exit on her crutches. I watched her go and felt like I should say something else, but my brain was too fried to form words. I left the courthouse and drove home in complete silence. My hands shook on the steering wheel the entire way. When I got to my apartment, I dropped my keys twice trying to unlock the door. I walked inside and collapsed on my couch without turning on any lights. My phone started ringing almost immediately. The screen showed numbers I didn't recognize. Then it rang again and again. Reporters, lawyers, people I hadn't spoken to in years. Everyone suddenly wanted to talk to me. I turned the phone off and sat in the dark silence. My body felt heavy and empty at the same time. Relief mixed with exhaustion mixed with something I couldn't name. I stayed on that couch for hours without moving. The next morning, my phone was still off when someone knocked on my door. I dragged myself up and checked the peephole. A man in a dark suit stood there holding a badge. I opened the door and he introduced himself as Desmond Harrell from the FBI. He asked if we could schedule an interview about the case. I invited him inside and we sat at my kitchen table. He explained the parents' scheme appeared much larger than anyone initially realized. They had been moving between states, taking in foster children and staging accidents for insurance payouts and lawsuits for at least a decade. His office was building a massive case against them. He needed my full statement about everything that happened. We scheduled a formal interview for 2 days later at the FBI field office downtown. He thanked me for my cooperation and left his card on my table. 2 days later, I drove to the FBI office and met with Desmond in a small interview room. A recording device sat on the table between us. I provided my full statement about everything from catching the baby, to the trial, to Betty's evidence. He asked detailed questions about the parents' behavior, their testimony, the fake witnesses. I answered everything as clearly as I could. Then he opened a thick folder and showed me files on 6 other victims who were sued or prosecuted after trying to help during staged accidents. 2 of them served prison time before the truth came out. One was a teacher who caught a foster child the parents pushed downstairs. Another was a store owner who helped during a staged slip and fall. A third was a driver who stopped when they deliberately caused a car accident. All of them were good people who tried to help. All of them got destroyed for it. I felt sick reading through the files. I almost became another casualty of this scheme. If Betty hadn't shown up with that video, I would be in prison right now. Desmond saw my face and told me I was lucky. He said most victims never get justice because the evidence isn't strong enough. Betty's video and documentation changed everything. He explained the baby was now in protective custody and doing better than expected. The injuries were serious but not permanent. Doctors were optimistic about full recovery. He said I probably did save the baby's life even though the fall was intentional. If I hadn't caught him, the drop from 5 stories would have been fatal. That information helped somehow. At least the baby would be okay. At least something good came from this nightmare. A few days later, Kirsten Weaver from Child Protective Services called me. She was building a case to terminate the parents' rights permanently. She needed to discuss my observations of them. We met at a coffee shop near my apartment, She had a notebook and recorded our conversation with my permission. I told her everything I remembered about their behavior. Their fake crying in the courtroom, their calculated performance when they first grabbed the baby from my arms, the way they switched from thanking me to suing me, how rehearsed everything seemed looking back. She took detailed notes and asked follow-up questions. She said my testimony would be crucial in ensuring the baby never goes back to them. The case was strong, but she wanted documentation from everyone who witnessed their deception. I signed a formal statement at the end of our meeting. That same week, the local news ran a story about the case. My name was mentioned multiple times. Suddenly, I was getting calls from national media outlets. CNN, Fox News, network morning shows. Everyone wanted an interview with the man who was prosecuted for heroism. My phone rang constantly with blocked numbers and media requests. I called Garrison and asked what I should do. He advised me to stay quiet until the criminal case against the parents were resolved. Any interviews now could complicate the prosecution. I declined all the interview requests, even though some reporters kept calling back. 2 weeks after the trial, the parents were formally charged with 12 counts: child endangerment, fraud, conspiracy, perjury, and attempted extortion. The prosecutor's office discovered they had run similar schemes in 4 different states: Oregon, Nevada, Arizona, and California. Each time they would move before authorities could build a case. Their bail was set at $500,000 each. They couldn't pay it, so they stayed in jail awaiting trial. The news showed footage of them in orange jumpsuits during their arraignment. They both looked defeated and angry. Around this time, I started having nightmares. I would dream about dropping the baby or about going to prison. Sometimes I dreamed the trial went differently and Betty never showed up. I would wake up sweating and shaking at 3 in the morning. My work performance suffered because I couldn't sleep. Finally, I called a therapist and scheduled an appointment. She listened to my story and explained I was experiencing trauma from being punished for doing the right thing. My brain was trying to process the injustice of almost going to prison for saving a life. The sessions helped, but I still flinched every time I heard a baby crying or saw someone in distress. My instinct to help people were now mixed with fear of what might happen if I did. Garrison called me about filing a civil lawsuit against the parents. He wanted to seek compensation for my legal fees, lost wages, and emotional distress. He warned me we probably wouldn't collect anything since they were broke and facing prison time. I told him I didn't care about the money. I just wanted it on record that they destroyed my life for 3 months. He filed the lawsuit the next day. A few days after Garrison filed the civil lawsuit, my phone buzzed with a text from Betty asking if I wanted to meet for coffee. I agreed, and we met at a small cafe downtown the next afternoon. She ordered tea and I got black coffee because I still wasn't sleeping well. Betty sat across from me and started talking about her time living with the parents when she was 16. They staged a car accident about 6 months after she moved in, she explained. The father deliberately rear-ended another car at a stop sign and then claimed the other driver had backed into them. They coached Betty to lie and say she saw the whole thing happen the way they described it. When Betty refused to lie to the police, they made her life terrible. They took away her phone, grounded her for months, and told her caseworker she was violent and unstable. Betty got removed from their home 3 months later, and the insurance investigation quietly dropped the case. She said she always knew they'd try something like this again, and when she saw them on the news after my arrest, she started digging into their history. The video she recorded that day was just luck because she happened to be getting coffee across the street and recognized them at the window. Betty pulled out her phone and showed me messages from other former foster kids. 4 of them had reached out after seeing the news coverage. Each one had a similar story about the parents using them as props in fraud schemes. One girl was told to fake a slip and fall at a grocery store. A boy was instructed to pretend a neighbor's dog bit him. Another kid was supposed to lie about being hurt at a daycare. Every time a foster child refused to cooperate or threatened to tell the truth, the parents made their lives miserable until they got removed from the home. Betty said the FBI agent handling the case told her they were building charges that could result in 30 to 40 years in prison for both parents. The pattern of using vulnerable children in fraud schemes across multiple states made it a federal case now. 2 days after meeting Betty, someone knocked on my apartment door around dinner time. I opened it to find my neighbor Amara standing there holding a covered dish. She lived 3 doors down, and we'd always been friendly but never really talked much. Amara said she'd been following my case in the news and felt awful that I went through everything alone. She offered to be a character witness if I ever needed one, and handed me the dish explaining it was homemade curry because she noticed I looked thinner lately. I thanked her and we talked for a few minutes in my doorway. She told me about losing her brother to a wrongful conviction years ago and how it destroyed her family's faith in the system. Her kindness made me tear up because it reminded me that good people still existed in the world. After she left, I ate the curry and it was the first real meal I'd had in days. 3 weeks after my charges got dismissed, the parents' criminal trial started at the downtown courthouse. I showed up on the first day because the prosecution said I'd need to testify. The courtroom was packed with reporters, other victims, and people who just wanted to watch. The parents sat at the defense table looking smaller somehow, like they'd shrunk since I last saw them. Their lawyers stood up for opening statements and tried to paint them as desperate people who made a terrible mistake out of love for their child. He talked about their debt and their fear of losing everything. The jury looked skeptical, though, especially the older woman in the front row who kept shaking her head. When Betty took the stand later that day, she walked the jury through the video evidence again and explained the pattern of abuse she witnessed. The defense lawyer tried to discredit her by bringing up her time in foster care and suggesting she was unstable, but Betty stayed calm and answered every question with specific facts and dates. The next day, the prosecution brought in their main evidence presentation. They had files on 8 previous schemes the parents ran across 4 states over the past decade. The total damages came to more than $2 million when you added up all the fraudulent insurance claims and lawsuit settlements. A teacher from Oregon testified about catching a foster child the parents deliberately pushed down a flight of stairs at the school. A store owner from Nevada described helping during a staged slip and fall, where the mother pretended to hurt her back. A driver from Arizona explained stopping after the parents caused a minor car accident and then got sued for $50,000. Each victim looked tired and angry as they told their stories. The defense lawyer kept objecting, but the judge overruled him every time. By the end of the second day, the pattern was so clear that even the parents' lawyer looked defeated. On the third day, I took the witness stand and the prosecutor asked me to describe my experience. I walked through everything from catching the baby to getting sued to almost going to prison for saving a life. I explained how I couldn't sleep anymore and flinched when I heard babies crying. The defense attorney stood up for cross-examination and tried to suggest I was making things seem worse than they were. He asked if I really thought my life was ruined by a few months of legal trouble. One of the jurors, a middle-aged man in a blue shirt, leaned forward and glared at the lawyer. When the defense attorney suggested maybe I should have just let the baby fall if I was so worried about getting sued, that same juror's face turned red and he crossed his arms. The judge had to call a brief recess because the jury was clearly getting angry. The prosecution called a doctor who treated the baby at the hospital. She brought the medical records and x-rays showing the fractures to both arms and both legs. The doctor explained that the injury pattern was absolutely consistent with a fall from 5 stories up, not from being roughly caught by someone. She walked the jury through what would have happened if nobody caught the baby and showed them photos of fatal fall injuries from similar heights. The doctor testified that my actions definitely saved the baby's life, and the injuries would have been much worse without my intervention. She said the fractures were unfortunate but expected given the physics of the situation. The defense lawyer tried to argue that maybe I caught the baby wrong, but the doctor shut that down by explaining there's no right way to catch a falling infant without some injury occurring. During cross-examination of the father on the 4th day, something unexpected happened. The defense lawyer was asking him about his financial situation when the prosecutor stood up and started pressing him about the video evidence. The father's answers got shakier and his voice started breaking. Then he just collapsed emotionally and admitted they planned everything. He sobbed that they were drowning in debt and didn't think anyone would really get hurt. His lawyer jumped up and tried to stop him from talking, but the damage was done. The father kept crying and saying they just needed money and thought it would work out. The mother sat next to him completely stone-faced, showing no emotion at all. She stared straight ahead like none of this was happening while her husband fell apart on the witness stand. The jury left to deliberate around 2 in the afternoon and came back just after 5. 3 hours total. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict, and the foreman stood up holding a piece of paper. Guilty on all 12 counts for both parents. The courtroom stayed quiet as the judge polled each juror individually to confirm their votes. Every single one said guilty without hesitation. The judge thanked the jury and scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. As the bailiffs led the parents out of the courtroom, Garrison leaned over and told me this was an excellent outcome. He said given the severity of their crimes and the clear pattern across multiple states, they'd likely face serious prison time. 2 weeks later, I returned to the courthouse for sentencing. The courtroom was full again with victims, reporters, and observers. The judge entered and everyone stood. She sat down and looked directly at the parents before speaking. Her voice was firm as she talked about how they betrayed every principle of parenthood and human decency. She said they weaponized the foster care system and turned vulnerable children into tools for profit. She explained that their actions destroyed lives and damaged people's faith in helping others. Then she announced the sentences. 12 years in federal prison for the father. 10 years for the mother. Both were also ordered to pay full restitution to all victims, though everyone in the courtroom knew they'd never be able to pay back $2 million. The parents showed no reaction as the bailiffs handcuffed them and led them away to begin their sentences. I stood there watching the bailiffs walk them down the center aisle toward the back doors. The mother kept her head down while the father looked back once at the empty gallery. Nobody came to support them. The courtroom stayed quiet until the doors closed behind them with a heavy click that echoed off the walls. The judge gathered her papers and left through her private entrance. People started standing up and collecting their things. I felt Garrison's hand on my shoulder, but I couldn't move yet. My legs felt weak and I gripped the table in front of me to stay steady. This was over. I was free, but instead of joy or relief, I just felt empty and tired. 3 months of my life had been consumed by fear and shame and anger. The parents were going to prison, but that didn't give me back the nights I couldn't sleep, or the friends who stopped calling, or the way people looked at me in public like I was a criminal. Justice happened, but it felt hollow somehow. Garrison asked if I was okay, and I nodded even though I wasn't sure. We walked out of the courtroom together, and reporters were waiting in the hallway with cameras and microphones. Garrison told them I had no comment, and we pushed through to the elevators. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun felt too bright after being inside all day. I drove home and sat in my apartment staring at the wall for 2 hours. A week later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A woman's voice introduced herself as Kirsten Weaver from Child Protective Services. She said she'd been assigned to the baby's case and wanted to give me an update. The baby had been removed from the hospital 3 days after the sentencing and placed with a foster family who specialized in caring for infants with medical needs. He was doing really well according to the doctors. The broken bones were healing properly, and he showed no signs of brain damage or developmental problems from the fall. The foster family was already talking about adoption if parental rights got terminated. Kirsten thanked me for saving his life and said the foster parents knew the whole story and wanted to meet me someday to express their gratitude. I told her I was glad he was safe and getting the care he needed. After we hung up, I cried for the first time since the trial ended. Knowing the baby was okay made everything feel more real somehow. Betty texted me a few days later asking if I wanted to get coffee. We met at a place downtown and talked for 3 hours. She told me more about her time in foster care and how the parents had treated her. They moved her between 4 different homes in 2 years, always finding reasons to send her back to the system. She figured out later they were trying to maximize their monthly payments by cycling through as many kids as possible. Betty was studying social work at the community college and working part-time at a youth center. She wanted to help other foster kids who'd been used or abused by the system. I told her that was amazing and asked if there was anything I could do to support her goal. We started talking about maybe creating some kind of foundation or support network for people who'd been victims of fraud schemes like the one we survived. It felt good to think about turning something horrible into something that might help others. Betty said she'd start looking into what it would take to set up a nonprofit. We exchanged numbers and promised to stay in touch. Walking back to my car, I felt lighter than I had in months. Garrison called me 2 weeks later with news about the civil lawsuit he'd filed against the parents. Since they were in prison and not responding to any legal notices, we'd won a default judgment for $200,000 in damages. He was honest that we'd probably never collect any of it since they had no assets and wouldn't be earning money in prison, but having the judgment on record meant something. The court officially recognized what they did to me was wrong. It was validation in writing that I could point to if anyone ever questioned what happened. Garrison said several other victims were also filing civil suits, and the parents would likely face millions in judgments they'd never be able to pay. I thanked him for everything he'd done and asked about his bill. He reminded me he'd taken the case pro bono and refused to accept any payment. He said cases like mine were why he became a lawyer in the first place. Going back to work felt strange and uncomfortable. My boss had been understanding during the trial and told me to take as much time as I needed. But after 2 weeks at home, I needed to get back to some kind of routine. The office felt different, though. I was anxious around people and kept thinking everyone was judging me or talking about me behind my back. I started avoiding the break room and eating lunch at my desk. Walking to and from my car, I found myself looking up at buildings and feeling scared something might fall. I couldn't walk under apartment windows anymore without my heart racing. My boss noticed I was struggling and offered to let me work from home 3 days a week. I accepted gratefully. Coworkers who'd completely ignored me during the trial suddenly wanted to be friendly again. They'd ask how I was doing or invite me to lunch. It felt fake and hollow. Where were they when I needed support? I kept my interactions brief and professional. Agent Harrell from the FBI contacted me about 6 weeks after the trial. He wanted to update me on their investigation into the parents' fraud operation. They'd identified 17 victims across 6 states who'd been targeted by similar schemes. Some had paid settlements to avoid prosecution. 2 had actually served prison time before evidence came out proving their innocence. The FBI had recovered documents and recordings showing over $3 million in fraudulent insurance claims and lawsuit settlements over the past decade. Several insurance companies were pursuing their own legal action to recover what they'd paid out. Agent Harrell thanked me for my cooperation and said my case was the breakthrough they needed to stop this operation. Without Betty coming forward with her evidence, the parents would have kept moving to new states and finding new victims. He said I should feel proud that my situation helped protect other people from going through the same thing. 6 months passed and I was doing better but still struggling. I'd started seeing a therapist twice a week to deal with anxiety and trust issues. She helped me understand that what I was feeling was normal after experiencing such a profound betrayal of the justice system. I'd done the right thing by catching that baby and got punished for it. That kind of injustice leaves scars that don't heal quickly. The therapist encouraged me to focus on the positive outcome. The parents were in prison. The baby was safe and thriving. The FBI had stopped a major fraud operation. I'd helped protect future victims even though it cost me 3 months of hell. She said I should be proud of surviving something that would have broken a lot of people. The nightmares were less frequent now. I could walk under buildings again without panicking. I was slowly rebuilding my life and learning to trust people again. A local reporter named Sarah Kirk had been covering the case from the beginning. She'd been respectful and hadn't tried to sensationalize anything. She reached out asking if I'd be willing to do an interview now that some time had passed. I'd been avoiding all media requests, but Garrison thought this might be a good opportunity. Sarah wanted to focus on the broken public defender system and how close I came to prison despite being innocent. She wanted to talk about the need for better investigation before prosecution. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop with Garrison present. The interview lasted an hour, and Sarah asked thoughtful questions about my experience with Mr. Ramsey and how overwhelmed he was with cases. I talked about Betty's courage in coming forward and how the system almost failed completely. The article came out 2 weeks later and focused on criminal justice reform rather than just my story. Several lawyers and advocacy groups reached out afterward, wanting to discuss how to prevent similar cases. It felt good to contribute to something bigger than just my own situation. 8 months after the trial, Kirsten called again. The foster parents who'd adopted the baby wanted to know if I'd be interested in meeting him. They'd finalized the adoption 3 months earlier, and the baby was doing great. I was nervous about it, but agreed. Kirsten gave me their address, and we set up a time for the following Saturday. I drove to their house in a quiet neighborhood with a knot in my stomach. A couple in their 30s answered the door with warm smiles. They invited me in, and I saw him playing with blocks on the living room floor. He was bigger now, almost 18 months old, with curly dark hair and bright eyes. When he looked up at me and smiled, I started crying. I couldn't help it. The foster parents, now his adoptive parents, came over and hugged me. They kept saying thank you over and over. They said they'd tell him every day about the brave man who saved his life. They showed me pictures of him at the park and at his first birthday party. He was healthy and happy and loved. Everything I'd been through was worth it to see him safe like this. Driving home from that visit, something shifted inside me. I'd been carrying so much anger and fear and bitterness about what happened. But seeing that little boy thriving and safe made me realize I could let some of it go. The parents were in prison where they belonged. Betty had found her voice and was helping other kids who'd been exploited. The FBI had stopped a massive fraud operation. The system had failed me initially, but truth won out in the end. I wasn't the same person I was before all this happened. I was more cautious and less trusting, and definitely more aware of how broken parts of the justice system could be. But I was also stronger and more determined to make something positive come from the experience. I could move forward now instead of staying stuck in anger and fear. The baby was safe. That's what mattered most. I started reaching out to friends I'd pushed away during the trial. The first call was to Johnny, my college roommate who texted me a few times early on, but I never responded. He picked up on the second ring, and before I could apologize, he said he was sorry for not being there more. We talked for an hour, and he admitted he didn't know how to help someone facing prison. I told him I understood and that I'd shut everyone out anyway. We made plans to grab dinner the following week. I called 3 more friends over the next few days, and the conversations went similarly. They felt guilty for not supporting me enough, and I felt guilty for isolating myself. Having people in my life again who actually cared made me realize how lonely I'd been. We started meeting up regularly for basketball games and dinners, just normal stuff that reminded me I was still a person with a life outside that nightmare. Amara invited me to her book club about a month later. I was nervous because I hadn't been around new people in forever, but she promised they were low-key and welcoming. The group met at a coffee shop every other Tuesday and discussed everything from mystery novels to memoirs. When Amara introduced me, she mentioned I'd been through something difficult recently, but didn't give details. A few people clearly recognized me from the news coverage, but nobody made it weird. They just treated me like a regular person who liked books. We talked about the current selection and debated plot points and character motivations. For 2 hours, I wasn't the guy who got prosecuted for heroism. I was just someone with opinions about a thriller novel. Driving home that night, I felt lighter than I had in months. Amara became a close friend over the next several weeks. She'd check in on me without being pushy and invite me to things without making me feel obligated. Her book club became a regular part of my routine, and I found myself actually looking forward to it. Being around people who knew my story, but didn't define me by it, helped me reclaim pieces of myself I thought I'd lost. I started remembering I had interests and hobbies and a personality beyond trauma. Betty called me one afternoon about 6 months after the trial. Her voice was excited in a way I'd never heard before. She'd just graduated with her social work degree and gotten a job offer from Child Protective Services. She was going to be investigating abuse and neglect cases, helping kids who were in situations like she'd been in. I told her I was proud of her and she started crying. She said our experience showed her she could turn pain into purpose. If she could help even one kid escape what she went through, everything would be worth it. We talked for over an hour about her new job and her plans. Her strength amazed me. She'd been abused and exploited, but instead of letting it destroy her, she used it to protect other vulnerable children. A year after the trial ended, I got a letter in the mail with a prison return address. My stomach dropped when I saw the father's name. I almost threw it away without opening it, but curiosity won out. The letter was 2 pages of small handwriting. He apologized for what he and his wife did, and admitted they destroyed multiple lives, including their own sons, for money they never even got. He said he thinks about what he did every day, and knows he deserves to be in prison. He wasn't asking for forgiveness or trying to make excuses. He just wanted me to know he understood the harm he caused. I read it 3 times and then put it in a drawer. I didn't respond and probably never would, but I kept it. Maybe someday I'd be ready to process it, or maybe I wouldn't. Either way, having his acknowledgement in writing felt important somehow. Garrison called me a few weeks later with an unexpected request. He was speaking at a legal conference about wrongful prosecution and public defender reform. He wanted to know if I'd be willing to share my story as a real-world example of how the system can fail innocent people. The idea terrified me, but I agreed because I wanted something good to come from what happened. The conference was at a downtown hotel with about 200 lawyers and legal professionals. I stood at a podium and told them about catching the baby, getting sued, facing prison time, and coming within minutes of conviction before Betty arrived. I focused on how overwhelmed Mr. Ramsey was and how that almost cost me a decade of my life. I talked about the need for better funding and support for public defenders. Several people came up to me afterward wanting to discuss criminal justice reform. 2 law professors asked if they could interview me for research projects. A nonprofit director gave me her card and said they needed voices like mine in their advocacy work. The speech led to more invitations over the following months. I spoke at a law school, a criminal justice reform rally, and a training session for new public defenders. I started consulting part-time with advocacy groups while keeping my regular job. The work was fulfilling in a way I hadn't expected. I was turning the worst experience of my life into meaningful change, even if progress felt slow. My therapist encouraged me to start dating again after about a year of isolation. The idea made me anxious because trusting people were still hard. She suggested starting small with coffee dates and being upfront about needing to take things slow. I met someone through a friend who knew my story, but didn't treat me like I was broken or fragile. We went on a few casual dates and talked about normal things like work and hobbies. It felt healthy and genuine in a way I wasn't sure I'd find again. We took things at a comfortable pace without pressure or expectations. The baby's adoptive parents reached out through Kirsten about 18 months after the trial. They wanted to invite me to his 2nd birthday party. I bought a toy truck and drove to their house feeling nervous and emotional. When I walked in, I saw him playing with other kids, running around and laughing. He was bigger now with more hair and a huge smile. His parents came over and hugged me. They said they'd tell him stories about the brave man who saved his life, and they'd explain everything when he was older. Watching him play, completely unaware of the darkness he was born into, made me cry. His parents told me they were raising him to be kind and brave. I stayed for the whole party, and it gave me a sense of closure I didn't know I needed. Betty and I met for coffee a few months later to discuss an idea we'd both been thinking about. We wanted to start a small nonprofit to help victims of fraud schemes navigate the legal system. We weren't lawyers, but we understood the confusion and fear of being targeted. We started with a basic website offering resources, referrals to lawyers, and information about reporting fraud. Within the first month, several people reached out thanking us for creating something that didn't exist when they needed help. It was modest, and we were learning as we went, but it felt meaningful. 2 years after the trial, I was in a much better place emotionally. I still had bad days where the memories hit hard, and I questioned whether I'd do it again. The experience changed me in ways that would never fully heal. I was more cautious about helping strangers, and more aware of how broken parts of the justice system could be. But I was also stronger and more committed to fighting injustice. I had friends, purpose, and hope again. The trauma would always be part of me, but it didn't define my entire existence anymore. About a year later, I got a letter in the mail from the state corrections department telling me the mother was up for parole after serving 3 years. My stomach felt weird when I read it because I thought she'd be in prison longer than that. The letter said I could submit a statement if I wanted to and attend the hearing. I spent 2 days writing my statement about what she did and how it affected me. I kept it simple and focused on the facts about how they planned to hurt their baby for money. The hearing was in a small room with 5 parole board members sitting at a long table. The mother sat on the other side wearing an orange jumpsuit and looking older than I remembered. I read my statement out loud and my voice shook a little, but I got through it. The board asked her questions about what she did and whether she felt bad about it. She gave rehearsed answers about being desperate and making a terrible mistake. One board member asked her directly if she understood she could have killed her baby, and she just said yes without any real emotion. After about 40 minutes, they told us to wait outside while they decided. 20 minutes later, they called us back in and said her parole was denied. They mentioned the serious nature of her crimes and said she didn't show real understanding of what she did. She'd have to serve at least 3 more years before trying again. I walked out feeling relieved but also empty, because it brought everything back. My relationship kept getting more serious over the next few months, and I realized I wanted my partner to meet the people who mattered most to me. I set up a dinner at a restaurant with Betty and the adoptive parents who were bringing the baby. I was nervous about everyone meeting, but it went better than I expected. Betty and my partner hit it off right away, talking about social work and advocacy. The adoptive parents were warm and friendly and told stories about the baby's personality and funny things he did. My partner was great with the baby and didn't treat the whole situation like it was weird or heavy. We stayed at the restaurant for 3 hours just talking and laughing. Walking home that night, I felt like I was building a real family of people who knew my whole story and cared about me anyway. It was different from my biological family, who I'd grown distant from during the trial. These people chose to be in my life knowing everything I'd been through. The adoptive parents started sending me photos and updates about the baby every few weeks. He was 3 years old now and going to preschool. The pictures showed a happy kid with a big smile playing with other children and doing normal preschool things like finger painting and playing on the playground. His parents said he was doing great, and the doctors saw no lasting problems from what happened to him as a baby. They said he was friendly and brave and loved making new friends. Every time I got an update, I felt this mix of emotions. I was so glad he was okay and living a good life. But I also thought about that moment when I caught him and how different things could have been. Seeing him happy reminded me why my body just reacted that day without thinking about the consequences. Some part of me knew catching him was the right thing, even though it almost destroyed my life. At work, things were going well, and I got called into my boss's office one afternoon. I thought maybe I was in trouble for something, but instead she told me I was promoted to a senior position. She said my advocacy work and the way I handled everything showed strong character and leadership. Having someone in a position of authority recognize me for something positive after being treated like a criminal felt important. I was rebuilding my reputation and my career on my own terms, instead of letting what happened define me forever. The promotion came with more responsibility and better pay. I accepted it and thanked her for believing in me. Agent Harrell called me a few weeks later with what he said was the final update about the case. The FBI investigation into the parents led them to 3 other fraud rings using the same tactics in different states. 17 criminals were convicted in total, and dozens of victims got some kind of justice or money back. He said my case was the starting point for a much bigger operation to stop these schemes from hurting more people. Knowing that something good came from my nightmare made it feel slightly less pointless. Agent Harrell thanked me for my cooperation and said I should be proud of helping take down a major fraud network. After we hung up, I sat there thinking about all the other people who went through similar things. At least some of them got justice because of what happened to me. Betty called me one evening sounding excited and told me she got engaged to someone she met through her job at Child Protective Services. I was really happy for her because she deserved good things after everything she survived. She asked if I would be part of the wedding party, and I said yes immediately. It felt meaningful that our connection started with shared trauma, but grew into real friendship. We'd both built good lives despite what the parents tried to do to us. Betty said the wedding would be small and simple, and she just wanted people there who truly cared about her. I felt honored to be included in that group. 3 years after I caught the baby, I got an invitation to a ceremony where the city was giving me a Civilian Heroism Award. I almost didn't go because I felt weird about being called a hero after everything that happened, but my partner convinced me it was important to accept recognition for doing the right thing. The ceremony was in City Hall with about 200 people in the audience. The adoptive parents came with the baby, who was 4 years old now and could talk in full sentences. Before the ceremony started, they brought him over to meet me. His parents knelt down and told him I was the person who saved his life when he was a baby. He looked at me with big, curious eyes and then gave me a huge hug. I started crying right there in the lobby because in that moment, everything I went through felt worth it. This little boy was alive and happy and safe because I reached out my arms that day. I stood on the stage accepting the award and looked out at everyone who came to support me. Betty was there in the 3rd row smiling. Amara sat next to her looking proud. My partner was in the front row recording everything on their phone. Garrison sat near the back, giving me a thumbs up. The adoptive family was on the side with the baby, who was wiggling around in his seat. The mayor read a statement about courage and selflessness and handed me a plaque with my name on it. I gave a short speech thanking everyone who stood by me when the system failed. The journey from hero to accused criminal to advocate was brutal and unfair, but I survived it and helped create real change. I wasn't the same person I was 3 years ago when I dropped my suitcase and held out my arms. That experience broke something in me, but it also made me stronger and more aware of injustice. I was proud of who I'd become and grateful for the people who refused to give up on me. Standing there holding the award, I felt like I could finally close that chapter and move forward without the weight of everything that happened crushing me anymore.